Hello and welcome to Maritain Musings. I'm Dr. Matthew Minard, and I'm pleased today to be joined by Dr. Brian Kemple from the Lyceum Institute, longtime member of the American Maritain Association and in the overall circle of Maritain people for a number of years. So I just want to welcome you today to the podcast, Brian.
Oh, thanks, Matthew. It's my pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
So one of our early podcasts as we started this was on the degrees of knowledge and all of its, hundreds of pages. Today, we're going to fill, as Dr. Kemple was telling me in the green room, so to speak, 3 hours. I assure you only 1 hour. 3 hours on one essay, Sign and Symbol, which is very important and quite interesting, actually, sui generis essay among Maritain's essays. There's another one that's related to it that we'll talk to as well. But before we dive into the thing itself, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and then your connection to the work of Maritain, how you got into him, etc. Yeah, and then what his lasting influence has been on you.
Yeah, so I got my PhD from the Center for Thomistic Studies at the University of St. Thomas in Houston in 2016. I wrote under John Deely, which already ought to give people some indication of how I came to this ambit. I wrote my dissertation on being as first known in Aquinas and the tradition, including Maritain and his own helpful comments on that, as well as Maritain's dear, secondary teacher, Ioannis the Sancto Toma, or John Ponso, as he's more familiarly known these days. But I actually encountered Maritain first in undergraduate, where I studied with another longtime member of the American Maritain Association, Herb Hartman. And we actually only read, I think, a little bit of Maritain here or there in class, but one day a fellow student had gone to some library that was closing down and came back with this big box of books. And he gathered a bunch of us around. He said, everybody, grab three or four books or something like that. But I went first, and immediately I saw this fascinating looking, dull gray volume. Like, oh, that looks interesting. I can't even read the spine.
Well worn.
Well worn, and it's the degrees of knowledge. And it's only gotten more well worn over the years. But a delightful, almost perfectly clean copy. Sort of sad a little bit to see a copy of this book perfectly clean. Almost.
So not well worn, just sitting in the sun too much, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, or at light. Okay.
But I grabbed it and was hooked and have been reading Maritain ever since. And then working with Deely at the University of St. Thomas, I don't know that there's a single conversation that passed without Maritain being mentioned at least once. So it was just sort of always there and always present. And I haven't read all of Maritain. I don't know anyone who actually really can make that claim. I'm sure a few people can, but there's always more, and he's one of these thinkers, I think, that there's a lot of things that we read and we maybe go, okay, well that's interesting, that's nice, and then there's a few thinkers where we read it and we go, oh, okay, I'm into it now. My brain is going, my mind is all over the place. Let me try and contain this excitement and do something with it, because that's always how it is with Maritain for me. So.
Yeah, it's like our fellow Maritinista as well, and one of John Deely's friends, Jacques Maritain, has said somewhere, it's on one of his pages online, he says, Maritain list of things, Maritain was right on this, and everyone else needs to catch up. Like, you feel like you're having to catch up with his thought. And I sort of pride myself in having read a huge percentage of the corpus, and yet I was just doing some work on Journée, and there was stuff in the political corpus that I was like, I'm not sure I've ever read that. Like, did it exist somewhere else? So I just got in the mail the other day a copy of this little book published during the war. And I'm not sure, because some of those essays I know had life elsewhere, but I'm not sure which version it is, because he's kind of the quintessential Frenchman, too, who's sort of fussing, and then eventually it lands in a real book, like a book where it's in its final form. And then there are all sorts of, like, addresses and things I know I haven't read. So, endless source of inspiration for one's thought, even in semiotics, which might surprise people who kind of come to this, have to find a good title to draw the semioticians in, and who aren't Deelyite semioticians, and they'll hopefully learn something here. So we're going to approach this. There are really two two essays that are in the background of our discussion today. Now, the one that we're not going to immediately bring up, but we're going to maybe circle back around to, at least to mention and give the contours of, is in a volume that I'm just going to hold up for the people who are watching this on YouTube and who aren't on the podcast. But there's a volume, Frontiers in Semiotics, that was put together by Dr. John Deely, and also his wife and another editor, in which there's an essay on language. But there was a little book on this. What is it? The spirit condition, the condition of spirit according to its incarnate conditions or whatever, was the original that the four essays that Maritain put together that had this sign and symbol essay that was then published in my copy's very beat up text, redeeming the time, entitled Sign and Symbol. So why don't you just provide, because it's really kind of doing at least two very different things in it. Why don't you provide a high-level outline of the article, and you can throw whatever anecdotes you desire in between in there as well.
Yeah, just one quick final publication note there as well. Redeeming the Time was also republished in 1972 under the title Ransoming the Time. So you get this sort of interesting...
Oh, I wonder who the translator was, because
yeah.
I'm trying to remember if Binns, who did the translation for this, if he also did the translation over for Science and Wisdom. There are issues in that translation on occasion, minor but important sometimes. Yeah, I have a French from the collected works of this, but it was originally in, what was that, four essays on spirit according in its embodied conditions, or its charnel, its embodiedness.
Something like that. This is also Binns. I have the 72 edition.
So they just republished Redeeming the Time as Ransom Time. Yeah.
But yeah, so sign and symbol. It's one of these essays that to give sort of the 30,000 foot view of something so small but dense and packed with details, because it really sort of I think any academic who's had to write something very interesting under a time constraint or while otherwise occupied can sympathize with the way that this essay unfolds, which is full of almost, as it were, promissory notes for something that never quite materialized in Maritain's own work. It's sort of like, hey, here's all this great stuff about signs. I'm going to go over it in, 30 pages or whatever. And we'll have to leave the rest for someone else to pick up and dive into more deeply. And as of yet, very few people have done that, unfortunately. So just to sort of break it down into, there's kind of an introduction of about a page and then three main sections of the essay. And the introduction, he's kind of just sort of laying out his hope for how anyone who's reading it will take up the question of signs and symbols and what exactly that they do. And he has this sort of provocative statement that, at the second sentence of the first paragraph, that sign involves the whole extent of moral and human life. It is in the human world a universal instrument, just as is movement in the physical world. So there's almost a sense in which, if you're thinking about this from the perspective of Aristotelian science, he's coming in and saying the human world, right? The world that is specifically human has the sign for its subject matter, in a sense, as sort of that to which all other things resolve in a study of what it is to be human. We're resolving it to an understanding of signs, just as in the study of the physical world, we resolve all things to an understanding of movement. So a sort of massive claim to put forward in such a short essay, and one that ought, for anyone aware of this, to be quite provocative. So then, I'm already going too far off into anecdotes here. This is why I said this could go 3 hours very easily. To move to the outline, the three main sections. First, he gives a theoretical overview of sign as such. And then he goes into what's really the bulk of it after that is concerning the magical sign and the nocturnal kingdom of the mind, which is just, again, such a wonderfully sort of poetic way of expressing what's going on there. And then finally, in a few pages towards the end, he discusses the fate of the magical sign. So there's almost sort of this bracketing of this main portion by the theoretical introduction, and then the sort of, almost as it were in a way, I take them almost as practical directives for us in how we ought to understand this distinction of signs that he lays out today. with, the sort of caveat that he first wrote this or published this, I think, in 1937. So the world has moved on in a lot of ways and changed in a lot of ways, but I do think there's nonetheless some very important practical directives. So just to break down those three sections a little bit more in just a little bit more detail, the theoretical discussion starts off with a definition of sign, being a good Aristotelian Thomist here, and he takes his definition from John of St. Thomas, John Ponceau, that signum est id quod representat aliod se potentia cognoscenti. The sign is that which makes or represents something other than itself to a cognoscitive power, let's say, a power of cognition in some way. And so he goes from there to discuss the causality which is proper to the sign, which is a very interesting case of formal causality, a kind of elaboration beyond the standard sort of Aristotelian discussion of form as the internal cause of a thing's constitution. And so we can get into that if we want to, but I'll bracket that for now.
I want to say, you may want to say just a word. We may not get back to it in detail. Just make it clear to someone who's walking in what kind of formal causality is it?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different names that we could propose for it. The one that Maritain uses here is objective causality, objective in that proper scholastic sense of the object being precisely that, a thing insofar as it is related somehow to a power. Or he also says formal causality of knowledge, right? So it's the way in which a thing by the form of the sign specifies some power to be related to an object. So in that sense, it doesn't become the form constituting the thing in its own entitative existence, but it constitutes its intentional mode of existence, right? Its way of being towards.
Yeah, and then the one thing to add too is it's vicarious in the case of signs. That it's
the vicegerent is the word that Ponceau likes.
Yeah.
And there's some interesting work that Dealey's written on that in elaboration in various different texts. Dealey, much like Maritain, has things that sort of appear in multiple iterations across his work. But I think the most extensive treatment of that is in
whatever you want to on that. Continue.
Yeah, I think the most extensive treatment that Dealey gives of that, or at least the first book published form of it, is in the 1994 volume on New Beginnings, on early modern philosophy, when he talks at some length about how signs work. But a lot of that was published in articles as well in different places. So after that, after a discussion, and it's a very brief discussion of the causality there, it's essentially a paragraph in Maritain, which... again, how dense and densely packed this all is. Then after that, he goes into just sort of the overall importance of the sign. And, just to quote very, very briefly one line from this, he says that the birth of idea and hence of intellectual life in us seems bound up with the discovery of the value of meaning of a sign, and that an animal employs signs without perceiving the relationship of meaning. To perceive the relationship of meaning is to have an idea, a spiritual sign. So again, he's pointing us back to that original claim, right? That this is as fundamental as anything to being human is our engagement with signs, that it's unique to us and that it's part of what makes us unique. But just to say that the birth of intellectual life is caught up with the discovery of the value of a meaning of a sign, in some sense. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please go. You're the interviewee.
Well, I was just going to say, it's maybe a sort of provocative claim to people who've not in any way engaged in semiotics. And I understand there's lots of reasons why some people might want to hear that term semiotics and go, well, okay, yeah, that's fine for you, but not for me. But there's a way in which he's saying that to be human really is to engage with signs and a study and an understanding of signs, at least to some extent. If you're not thinking about the sign and what the sign does, you are in some sense not, fully realizing what it is to be human. So again, huge claim.
In which, the observation I was just going to make is this is 37, which at least one of the early versions, or basically, which is basically the settled version. He just has finished the degrees of knowledge. And although there might be something, I'd have to go back through notes from a long time ago to see whatever he said. Imagine structurally how much that would change what he did in degrees of knowledge, if that's something that were thematic, right? It's possible
Yeah.
it wouldn't overthrow it, but I think, boy, it would have a significant and interesting role.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's the various later editions of degrees, which he doesn't change too substantially.
Mhm.
But I do kind of wonder. It would be interesting to do a comparison between the first and the last version, and just sort of see, is there anything in here where maybe you at least subtly see the influence of this notion
Yeah.
about signs?
Or maybe just so
Because
structural. He knew he just couldn't touch the beast, and it
yeah,
had to stay as was because it's a little bit made up of some of those are articles in there. So the coherence of that volume. I mean, it's coherent, but it's coherent in the way of like something he's working on piece. So I don't know. Anyway, it's just striking. Like you just think it's Dealey's project, which is this semiotic project that's however Thomist is trying to cash out this kind of claim, right? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, you could say that it sort of becomes Dealey's life work by the early 1980s at the latest, if not before then. Um, and I kind of just wonder, and I don't know, and this is very much an aside, and we can sort of move on from it quickly. But you might know better the publication history of degrees and the various editions. Were all of the appendices originally in there, or were those perhaps
No,
added
no, 'cause
later?
there are some appendices in the degrees of knowledge which were added later, like the one on subsistence, right? Because it was in the original. I actually don't know in the very first edition if every single one was there, although most of them date from sort of things going on in the 30s, and so I suspect that they are all there, right? He does the one on different speculative and practical, partially in response not only to what Garrigue's doing with mysticism, but also Simone's book, which came out at the same time. There's stuff on Gardet. He updates the subsistence one in the 50s, but I think it's in the first edition. So then the only thing that comes up is there are a couple small ones at the end, and that's where I
Okay.
wish I had a set of the collected works. But we should be
Well,
careful. Let's be careful because this will turn into Dr.
yeah.
Kemple and I know each other, and we've been in these sorts of musing conversations, and we just have to be careful. But we want to give this outline of the text. That's my fault just as much. So
Well, yeah. So I'll just say one thing and then move
yeah,
on, because my question there is sort of thinking about the appendix on the concept, because that's very semiotically infused, even if he doesn't quite use the language so much. But in
it's
talking
in
about this,
it's in the
the
first.
concept is the concept
That's
is
in
a
the first.
species expresse, right?
Mhm.
There's this whole thing about it, id quote and in quo and id in quo, which is very Dealey territory. So we'll put that off.
Although
But okay,
good scholastic territory, it has good
good
grounding.
scholastic territory.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
But
It's very important, very, very crucial for understanding the development of Thomism, and things that I think are implicit in Thomas, just barely below the surface of his own language, that are not at all hard to see there. But okay, so after this sort of emphasis upon the just absolutely pivotal importance of the sign for the human being, then Maritain goes through a good sort of scholastic practice here of laying out some divisions of different kinds of sign and different ways in which we understand signs to function. So primarily, there the divisions that he attends to are between the practical and speculative sign, which we'll talk about a bit more here, I have a feeling, going forward, and then the instrumental and formal signs. So these are distinctions. I'll save the speculative and practical, but the instrumental and formal, for anyone unaware of the distinction, is essentially between something wherein what's considered the sign has to first be apprehended and appreciated in some sense as an object, in order that we then make a move to recognize the object signified. So smoke signifying fire is the sort of classic easy example of this, because you have to know what smoke is in some sense first as an object in order to recognize that further thing that it signifies itself, the fire. And most of the things that we tend to think of as signs are instrumental signs, stop signs, exit signs, words as printed or spoken. Any number of things that you can point to in the physical world are going to be an instrumental sign insofar as they signify anything. Um, in contrast, the formal sign refers exclusively to, as he says here, mental forms, whose entire essence is to convey meaning or to signify. So concepts, and we might even say something like percepts in a way, but even that gets pretty messy and muddy and confusing without too much going into it here. We'll get into it with the magical
Yeah.
signs
And the point, yeah,
quite
and
a
the point
bit.
that's being made there is that there's a kind of creation of there's a semiotic work that's going on in perception that's sub-intellectual. So that's
Yeah.
all. Just for the listener who's not in the weeds on this, it's sort of the semiotics of animals, plants, then even potentially lower. Maritain only hints at it here and there, but it's there in the account. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a way in which, as dense and complex as this essay is, it is kind of approaching the question of the sign quo ad nos, right? Which is within our own experience. How do we make use of signs? How do we experience them operating? From which you can go into these much bigger questions of semiotics and just realizing how far signs permeate the universe, which, according to Charles Sanders Peirce, the founder of American semiotics, is everywhere. Right? The entire universe permeated with signs. So then after that, to continue the outline, he goes into more detail on practical signs, and most especially how they figure into sacraments, which is where there's the most elaboration in John Ponceau on the nature of the practical sign. So we can touch on that a little bit as well, but that's actually not an area that I've gotten too deep into myself, just because it's such a rabbit hole that, I mean, you start talking about sacramentology and the efficacy of signs therein, and how exactly they convey things, and you're always sort of touching on mystery at that point. So it's very complex, and um, my theological credentials are minimal, let's say. So I try not to say too much, because I might say something that is quite wrong. So. But then, yeah, that's sort of where he wraps up the kind of theoretical introduction, at which point he begins turning towards this distinction of the uh, logical sign, as he calls it, and the magical sign, in the second section on the magical sign in the nocturnal kingdom of the mind. And so this is a very, I mean, again, super rich point. There's some interesting difficulties here, I think, in the sense of you really have to clarify what's meant by logical sign in a lot of ways. Because I think a lot of people, in hearing that, they might think, oh, okay, well, we're talking about, the art of logic. We're talking about how things work in, terms and propositions and syllogisms. But that's not what Maritain's getting after with that distinction. Rather, he says that it's essentially a sign located in a certain functional status wherein it is a sign for the intelligence taken as the dominant factor of the psychic regime or of the regime of culture. And so this is that sort of clarified, reflectively grasped sign as such, where we realize, okay, here's the sign, here's the thing that it signifies. We are consciously aware of the distinction of those two, that the signifier and the signified are distinct from one another, and that there's an ability of our own awareness to navigate these distinctions and relations. And this is contrasted to the magical sign, or as he says, a sign in the sphere of the dream, located in another functional status, wherein is a sign for the imagination taken as a supreme arbiter or dominant factor of all psychic life, or of the life of culture.
Can I
So,
ask too? When he
sure.
says imagination, do you think he's talking about the cogitative power actually?
I mean, he seems to be talking about it in that sort of general sense of, the way
Fantastic.
Fantasia,
Yeah.
yeah.
So
Which, I mean,
memory,
I was just
cognitive
working
power.
on something on this yesterday, so I'll try not to rabbit hole myself yet further. Um, it's this sort of fascinating thing that Ponceau has a great commentary on this in the natural philosophy of Quarta Pars of his Cursus Philosophicus, where he's talking about internal senses, and he gives this really lucid commentary on sort of the Aristotelian tradition and the various confusions that go on there, because there are a lot. I mean, Aristotle himself is confusing in this way. He seems to be using the term imagination here in much the way that Aristotle does in Book 3 of the De Anima,
Hmm.
where it's kind of a little bit back and forth between the particular power of the imagination and the whole ambit of powers that we later distinguish therein. But Ponceau gives this actual term to the internal powers that we refer to internal sensation, the operations of it, of phantasiare, sort of like operating on phantasms,
Hmm.
which is richer than perception, which tends to be strictly outwardly directed. So I think there's a sense of the phantasiare really that's going on here when we're talking about imagination. So creative imagination, recollective imagination, sort of all the various judgments and evaluations that we make at a sense perceptual level concerning signs, is where the magical sign is operative. So this, as he goes on from this, he says that this sort of leads to different states of awareness, we might say, or maybe even we could say different states of semiotic awareness. That there's a fuller realization of our own semiotic capacity when we exist in the state induced by the logical sign, whereas we are more akin to animals in a lot of ways. Not that we're animalistic and truly animals or something like that, subhuman, when we exist in a state dominated by the magical sign, but that our intellectual capacities are almost, as it were, suffused into the world of imagination. We lack these various distinctions. So there's another great quote here where he says that when we are in the logical state, sensations, images, ideas are bathed in sunlight, bound up with the luminous and regular life of the intelligence and of its laws of gravitation, whereas in the magical state, all these things were of the night, bound up with the fluid and twilight life of the imagination, and with an experience which was of an amazingly powerful impact, but entirely lived, and to the extent that it was an object of reflection, dreamed. So it's powerful imagery, I think, to convey to our imaginations what it's like to live in a state of imagination. There's sort of this, twilight. Everything's kind of hazy. The distinction of objects fades, and as you move further into night, your awareness of what things are becomes blended in a way, right? Sounds sort of carry in a different way, and you see objects in outline only, but you don't really grasp, precisely what they are with any clean detail. And so one thing looks much like another. It's an interesting thing that I think a lot of us maybe experientially forget to some extent because we don't spend an awful lot of time any longer outside in the night, in the dark. Wherever we do go outside in the dark, and now we have all sorts of artificial illumination, whether they be the lights of our cars or the flashlights embedded in our cell phones. So it's rare that we truly spend time in the darkness and see something like, is that an animal? Is that a tree? Is that a human?
Yeah, it's exactly. Even if we're in the dark somewhere completely away from light or that, it's still and with no phone or anything, it's still a domain that's potentially illuminable. So we don't let ourselves sort of sink into the being present to that, not as a problem to be solved if I only had a light. I mean, it's very difficult to get yourself there. It's the same kind of thing. It's very difficult to imagine what this would be like even for a child, because you can't even say that this is like how a child interacts with the world, because from very early on, perhaps even in utero, because of the mediation of language of the mother, the the child's imagination and incipient intellect are already being formed by the domain of a fully acculturated logical sign, to use Maritain's terminology, state of culture to begin processing reality in that way, at least predominantly. At least predominantly. He talks about the way that still there's sort of embedded the magical sign culturally
Mhm.
in our practices and so forth, and it can, even in our intellection, sedimented there. But yeah. Just a thought I had.
Yeah,
So, yeah.
there's a great passage in Yves Simon's Introduction to the Metaphysics of Knowledge where he talks about the closest that we can come to life without language or experiencing that is really in those states where you're not quite asleep, right? And you're sort of the mind is just sort of drifting and wandering, and it's very imaginal, right? You're not really articulating in any way the intelligibilities of the things that you experience. It's a I go back to that passage all the time just to try and highlight, that point, because we don't realize, to your point, how immersed in the logical sign we are. Um, although I think there's some very interesting points about the influence of the magical sign today that maybe we'll get to in a little bit. Because one of the things that the Maritain then goes on to discuss is this sort of the characteristic of the state is one of indistinction, a lack of distinction. He refers to it as a kind of slurring of the speculative and the practical, and a kind of slurring of the significative and the efficient, the different kinds of causality. And in this sort of slurring muddle that's characteristic of the primitive mind, you find that there's almost this sort of sense of something like a deep enchantment, right? The whole world is sort of enchanted with the power of signs. There's a way in which, to the primitive mind, language has this inherently magical quality, because it seems to conjure up things almost as it were, despite their nature as mobile. So things move and change in different ways to the primitive mind by the efficacy of signs that, we modern scientific people wouldn't be able to really even conceive of what that's like. And so this leads then very quickly into some interesting points about how there's a kind of science for the primitive person, but it's sort of blended with and confused with magic in various ways, and the distinctions aren't really clear. So I would almost sort of read it as kind of like a free scientific state, as they're sort of starting to recognize the distinction between signs and their objects. And then he goes into myth, and myth is really, I find, a generally fascinating topic to discuss. There's very interesting. I mean, again, I'm not going to go into all the details here because there's so many, and we could spend all day here. But in talking about myth, first of all, I'd also recommend the great article by John Deely on myth. I can't recall the title of it right now off the top of my head.
Integral objectivity, myth and integral objectivity, or something like that.
Something like that.
It's in
which
the
Deely makes
put together.
Yeah,
it works if someone.
The 21st century reader.
Thomism for 21st century, a Deely reader, or something like that. Yeah. Actually, it's a good selection of his stuff.
Yeah. And so the point about the myth is that it's not really essentially concerned with the veridicality of its claims, but a kind of practical, consequence of it. The practicality of the myth, as Maritain says, is in its efficacity of propitiation, which how's that for a $15 phrase if ever you want to sound good at a cocktail party, right? But it's this sort of idea, right, that it doesn't really matter whether or not it's true. It matters whether or not belief in it positively impacts the way that people live. And so this is in some way why the myth is kind of the height of primitive culture, because it's what really gives them their guiding lights for how they live. And I think there's something really, evocative about that for us today as well. So maybe we'll get to that in a moment. But I just to finish the outline, since this is supposed to be, a brief high-level outline, I'm getting into all the very fascinating, interesting details. The last section on the fate of the magical sign, which is relatively short, it's just a handful of pages. He sort of talks about how there's, the magical thought and the magical sign are destined to be cast aside insofar as they're magical, right? That as we sort of enter into the state induced by the logical sign, and we realize that there are these real distinctions between the sign and the signified, that we can't really just remain in that nocturnal state. So it's really sort of impossible by our nature. But that, and this is, I think, just absolutely important, that they continue in, he says it is true, in a virtual state. and as though cut off and purposeless in the immense subterranean reservoir of the imagination, of the passions and the emotions. And I think that choice of the word virtual is quite important, right? It's not just potential; it's virtual. There's a real force and a power there, even if it's not explicitly, distinctly realized precisely as the magical sign any longer. So, the choice of words always being so important, and Maritain always being one that I think is conscientious, if perhaps at times mistaken in the choices of words that he uses at different places. Then he goes on very quickly to discuss the influence of the magical sign on art and how that sort of shapes and modifies our development of artistic creation. Art, which he describes as being formulatively speculative signs, but virtually, again, practical by a kind of superabundance, which is itself, another topic for
Yeah,
a
yeah,
whole
he's basically
volume.
formal eminent, like or virtual eminence is what he's thinking of. I mean, this is the problem with him. He's not using the scholastic terminology willy-nilly. He is using it as though it's meant, and so hence he makes claims. Sometimes even if they're wrong, he's making that claim, but it can be obtuse to people who aren't initiated. It's to
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And then finally, after that, the last distinction that he makes is between the direct sign, that which indicates an object, and the reverse sign, which indicates the subject for whom or to whom it is assigned in some way. And so
yeah.
there's interesting points there too.
Yeah, I know. 'Cause I'd like to poke at that a little bit speculatively because I think that's a hard division that different kinds of signs actually have elements of both, but we're not going to talk about that now. That's why I should come over to your Lyceum and actually talk, have conversations there.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
well, I think that has a lot actually to do with an existential epistemology. So we might
there we go.
be able to.
There's reasons that Dr. Kemple's bringing this up, but the problem is it'll date the podcast. They'll all know when it was if we go too far. Just as I think I'll find a way to get our other questions wrapped in. I may skip something that
Mhm.
we've covered to a degree. But as I'm listening to this, because it is kind of current now, and I think it'll be current for a few years at least. Um, you know, as you talk about this, even using the language of primitive, right? I'm sure you're like me that nowadays it catches in your throat a little bit because you don't want to say something that's going to sound too colonialist or something like that. Um, but the other thing that came to my mind actually when you said it was there's a lot that's in here that's actually quite relevant for these discussions which are happening like around the work of someone like, and I think people that have been talking about this, like Ian McGilchrist or Rod Dreher he's kind of popularizing this stuff in this book that he has coming out about wander and whatever. And David Bentley Hart has a book that just came out as well. All things are full of gods, which at some point I have to read. It's like I just get nervous because I know if you ever disagree with David Bentley Hart, he doesn't like it. Um, maybe just a word or a couple words about maybe just the relevance, because I think it is actually quite relevant to these discussions about kind of critique. They're coming down the line of critiques of modernity and questions of myth and understanding and a holistic apprehension of reality in contrast to the kind of logico-rational schema of at least modern epistemology, modern logic, etc.
Yeah, and a lot of this stuff too gets bound up with discussions of things like technology and technological environments, and how the sort of Marshall McLuhan line of things of media being extensions of our faculties, and by their use they alter the ratios of our faculties, and altering the ratios of our faculties they thereby constitute new kinds of environment, and then this sort of reflects back into some of these neurological questions that someone like a McGilchrist or what have you will discuss, sort of divided brain hypothesis, which I'd touch that one, but only with about 100-foot stick, and I've only got
Yeah,
a
exactly.
40-foot stick to hand.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
um, but I think what the interesting point there is, there's something true to that. They're on to something. There's something about the way in which the media do influence our habits of attunement, let's say,
Mhm.
and I do think that Maritain, again, writing this in 1937, that's before the advent of television, and the impact that television has had on how minds process signs, I think, is pretty profound. Um, you know, I grew up with a television in the house. It was a regular thing for it to be on in the evenings. And now I reflect back on that and I think, oh no, what were we doing to ourselves, right? How were we suffusing ourselves into this sort of nocturnal kingdom of the mind with television? Because I think we were in a lot of ways. We were eliciting the strength of that virtual resonance of
Mm-hmm.
magical signification in our experience. And so I think, again, not to go too much into the sort of neurological things, but there is some way in which, the brain being the organ of the powers of perception or interior sensation or whatever, does suffer quite a bit from that sort of engagement with these media. The way in which those things signify, habituate us, ways that we haven't even come close to realizing, I think. There's a physical question there as well. I mean, there's some very interesting issues with respect to how screens, for instance, affect developing brains, especially. Um, Again, it's so hard to
That's
stay
it.
online
Yeah,
here.
that's
Uh,
fine. Like, I'm just making the point that there's stuff about sort of the exact, and you got there, I think, naturally about this question of how the mind has been affected by both the technological matrix generally, and then the various media, which really, in a sense, technology functions very often as a media. I mean, that's McLuhan's examples are media in a rather broad sense too. I mean, it's technologies that do this as well, that mediate as instrument our perception, but how this plays on that divide between this logical state of signification, the logical state of intellection, and this sort of more nocturnal dominance of fantasiari, of the active, imaginative, or even like recollective imaginative or whatever, mediation of our experience, and
well,
how that's
and I think,
grown.
yeah, one of the ways in which this seems really evident to me, that there is this sort of, I don't want to call it a full scale regression into something like being primitive, but there is a kind of, I don't know, resurgence of this nocturnal domination of the imagination, and that I think you can see a lot of people don't really understand the distinction in their, even a sort of incipient way, between speculative and practical signs. And you see that a lot of people, the way in which people interpret norms of behavior from things they see on television is a good example of that, or that they see on social media, which is essentially everyone having their own television channel,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is terrifying. But there's a kind of normativity that goes on there, in that this is how you act, right? This is the way to act, right? Based upon this sort of receptivity. There's no real distinction.
Yeah. And even beyond that, because there's at least some kind of practical signification that goes on whenever we have storytelling, right? There's a kind of practical moral signification. I don't usually engage in this because it feels like a bit like talk radio commentary, but some of the cultural tendency, especially among those who are younger and have been more influenced by, the technology from younger neurological points, um, to see certain speculative claims as having a kind of deep practical danger in them. Not just a question of like, they make me feel unsafe. I'm not making that kind of low hanging fruit comment,
Mhm.
but the idea that there are some things that just cannot be said because they seem to have just, two steps removed from something that's, seemingly nefarious. Now, I mean, it's obvious that sometimes whenever you present as possible some atrocity in history, like you really are potentially opening up a kind of practical signification that atrocity is okay. So I'm not saying that this is a totally wrong thing, but you have to have really good instruments for parsing out what is the speculative aspect of this, which is the laying forth the intelligibility of the thing I'm talking about aspect of signification, versus the kind of signification that presents to the mind a possibility for action, whether it's past and now perceptive for the future or not. I think that is true. I think there is a slurring of the two together, which probably it is like once again, it's like that magical state, but we're not saying everyone's becoming primitive. I mean, we're not sitting from our book filled perches saying that, but we're just observing the currency of what Maritain's analysis enables one to sort of get into the current situation and pull apart the threads.
Well, right, and even to go back to your point about the implicitly practical sense of media, or like entertainment media, especially, I think, going back to his point about the virtual practicality of art. I mean, I wouldn't consider Marvel movies to be high art in any sense, but they are an art, and there is a kind of implicit practicality which I think a lot of people learn from those environments, which is in some sense just this absolutizing of the distinction between good and evil in human affairs, as though okay, well, these people are clearly all evil and these people are clearly all good, and whatever you want to do to destroy the all evil is justified in some way. So that's quite practically dangerous in our environments today, where you can't make those sort of speculative distinctions to realize that there's good guys and bad guys, sure, but the good guys sometimes do bad things and the bad guys sometimes do good things, and you can't just sort of lump everything together in one or another category.
Yeah, let alone in a pluralistic society where you're trying to figure out how to negotiate the lines of how then to understand the acceptable boundaries of those as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, this is sorry. Well, this is. I mean, it's all super interesting. And this, we always these are the interviews that they can be a little bit open ended. But this is the kind of stuff, and this was not meant to be pitching the Lyceum, but over at the Lyceum, these are kind of discussions that one can have. So, not meaning to pitch it, but I think it's appropriate because I think this stuff's really important. So I think we're on the very edge of this. We're going to be really short on this. Let's just make sure that we do draw attention to the listener that probably Maritain here is the only Thomist I've ever run into yet. And as you know, I've been digging around a little bit more, and I know of some of the sacramental theologians who do this. But the issue of practical sign, and this reminds me, I have a note here that I've had from the beginning of the interview. There's technically a version of this essay that existed in the Sewanee Review that does not have the footnotes that are included in the book publication. That's very important because Maritain basically goes to the ninth volume of John of St. Thomas. Maybe that might be a reportatio. It's not a completely edited, at least, section of the Cursus Theologicus on sacraments in general and then particular sacraments. And in there, John of St. Thomas lays out a theory of practical signification, the way that something can be presented to the practical intellect, the intellect as operative in agency. He presents this in a way that it's kind of unparalleled. It's very strange that it's so detailed in him and it never gets picked up. So just maybe very quickly just draw attention to this in Maritain, because I think it's an important bit of just like at the level of even a researcher who's still with us at this point, not frustrated, that it's an interesting entree into that, this essay is.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say very quickly, I hope they speed it up at Salem to publish the critical edition of the Cursus Theologicus, because we only have the first 5 volumes I think that they've done, and 8 they have planned, so we have the Vives edition, which makes do for now. But yeah, I mean, just drawing on what Ponso says there, and that footnote, I think it's something like. Or their end notes in my version, which is always an unfortunate thing. But it's note 9 where he discusses the distinction between the practical, or what exactly the signum practicum is, right? And he makes this really interesting point that it's in some way kind of compositive, right? It's not acquisitive. It's not towards acquiring cognition. It doesn't respect the thing by resolving and abstracting, but rather by composing it with something, insofar as it intends some end. And so this notion of signs as composing, signs as constitutive in some way of the world in which we live, I think this is, this is another whole podcast episode just on this point alone, right? How it is that human beings are able truly to be creative, right? To really participate in some creative activity can only be understood through practical signs. Right? If we just had sheer efficient causality, all we're doing is pushing things around, right?
We're
just rearranging
we're pushing
the
around
furniture.
the same things, basically.
Yeah. Yeah,
More of the
just
same.
rearranging the furniture. It's all we're
Yeah.
doing. But it's really through this understanding of signs as not just ordered towards revealing the practical, but as actually engaged in praxis in some way, that they bring things into being. And most especially, I would say, the kinds of relations that human beings are involved in. So all sorts of activities that we do. So take something like, intentional speech acts and someone like John Searle, right? It's a very interesting notion that he brings up there, but devoid of an understanding of practical signs, it just falls flat, I
Yeah.
think.
No, that is spot on because actually that discussion in Searle very much parallels what Cardinal Bo did in his sacramental theology. He uses the same kind of ideas, like the idea that whenever you enact a contract or whenever you designate someone in a given role, the act of speech creates the status for the person that you've now designated in that role. You're not just signifying; you're doing something. Now, the question is, what kind of doing? And this is where Cardinal Bo he basically tried to push too much efficient causality into it. It's not really efficient causality, but he creates a halfway house between objective causality and I'm saying physical in my mind. Sorry, I'm thinking like scholastic or efficient causality. Um, so you need these discussions to really parse that out. And I mean, I think that debate in BO that then like McCart and others responded to him uh, is actually like philosophically very interesting for the exact reason that you point out here.
Yeah, and I mean, I think what's often missing there, and this is why Maritain drawing on Ponceau is so important, and going back to Ponceau is so important because again, he saw all this stuff with a great perspicacity that
Hundreds
just
of years ago,
yeah, 400 years ago.
and with
Almost.
great perspicacity, I had to emphasize that I cannot figure out the history of this. I've done some digging. I
Yeah,
cannot get antecedents. I mean, there has to be something, but I don't know. It's very strange,
yeah.
the
I mean,
level of detail.
he's picking up on obviously all these things from Aquinas. I mean, the
Sure,
social
yeah.
versus theologicus. But I mean, you read Aquinas, you're going to say, okay, I don't see how
Ye-
he's getting this out of there.
Yeah, because on this topic, I mean, people say a
Yeah.
lot of things that are pretty superficial about the distinction between practical and speculative design, like among even by the time you get like just downstream of him, like someone like Lugo or in the Jesuits, or before him, or even after him, like certain Franciscan authors I've run into, but it's like just super like in them high level. And
Yeah.
it's developing Thomas, but I mean, it's kind of striking. This is one of these sections that really strikes me. I don't know what's in the mix in Iberia at that time that gets him to this
Yeah,
point.
there's some great conversations that unfortunately we're not privy to. Probably, I mean,
Yeah,
they had to be talking about these
yeah,
things,
exactly. Yeah, it's like
in
not just sort of on his own in his head.
yeah,
Yeah. All right. So I think I've decided, and this is good for the podcast too, because it ensures that we'll have more. We're going to come back in a later one to the essay on language and the theory of sign, because I think that's actually, it might be worth specking out a little bit about Maritain on language. So maybe I suspect that I'll have to have you back on for that because you're sort of the guy who's interacted with all this as John Dealey's survivor from UST.
yeah,
So we'll come back, some episodes in the future. We'll put a few that are not semiotic in there. Lest the membership think that I've taken over and made this the Dealey Maritain Hour. Um, so we've already actually kind of covered in the lengthy overview. Kind of one of the other questions I had here. Clearly, it's not just a question of purely kind of pure semiotics in the sense that it's just cashing out semiosis, the interaction of signs, because there's this element as well here about kind of the functional state of the intellect in the quote unquote magical state. And as I was putting these questions together, when I hear state in Maritain, I immediately think also of his treatment of Christian philosophy. And right, he talks about how when we speak of Christian philosophy, there's some Christian philosophers have some objective content that they're getting, even though they have to philosophically consider it, but they're getting it from what they know by faith. And so there's a kind of objective element to this. But also, too, subjectively, the state of the intellect is in a different state because of the influence of the light of faith. And even actually, the fallen intellect is in a different state as well. So, he basically makes the point is that the intellect hasn't changed, but the state of its operation has changed. And he's dealing with this in the natural supernatural divide. But there's another kind of state of the intellect thing going on here in his claims. I think that's my kind of intro. You can say whatever then in response with regard to the magical versus logical state of sign use, because he talks about
Yeah,
the signs, the logical sign, the magical sign, but also the magical state.
yeah. I mean, I think this is one of the points that I find a lot of semioticians are weakest on, unfortunately, and this is where there's great potential for fruitful harmony between semiotics and Thomism, is that the end result in a lot of ways of the sign, right, is how it alters the being to whom it is a sign. Right. And so when we're talking about these different states, I think we're talking about different ways in which, by the sign's relation to an object, the interpretant in semiotic language is fundamentally, or not fundamentally, but altered in a way profoundly with respect to habit. Is what always comes to mind for me. Whenever I see someone talking about the state of an individual, I'm thinking about how do habits change the way that that individual holds himself, right? Both internally and with respect to the world outside. Right, habits are a very fascinating topic as well, and I'll trim myself there on that one. But if we're thinking about how we exist habitually in the world, just as a whole, right? The habits of the whole, how those exist in the world. I think if we're thinking about going back to that point about slurring, right? We all have that experience to some extent of a kind of temporary slurring of our consciousness and our awareness of things, right? Hazy in the morning before you have your coffee. I'm always in a slurred state where distinctions between signs and their objects are not particularly clear to me. And probably late in the evening too at this point as I begin to age into how I've always felt at heart of being an old man. But you realize this sort of, we've probably all even had maybe, let's say in our lives, different points where we are maybe not as intellectually inclined. Presuming the audience of this is going to be mostly people who are scholastics and academics, right? We're sort of always engaged in the logical state, we hope. But if you go through a tragic experience, let's say, or something which sort of shocks you out of your normal patterns of behavior, or I can just very personally speak to a time where I was very isolated from other people. And there was a sense in which the state in which I found myself on the day to day was kind of a little bit maybe imaginal in terms of how it was sort of dominated. If you're not engaged in work, if you're not engaged in moving towards a purpose with some real conscious awareness of what that purpose is, it's very easy to experience that slurring on the day to day. And it's a matter of habit. Right? The only way to get out of that sort of slurred imaginal state is changing your habits in some way of attuning yourself to these different objects regularly, to the specific clarified object of the logical sign. And so too, I think that applies to when we discuss these things spiritually as well. Right? If you're not, consistently receiving the sacraments, say, if you're not engaged with that practical sign, the way in which you operate is going to be different. You're going to live differently on the day to day. So I think, just to very briefly gloss that point, we're thinking about our different states and the habits that constitute those states that also constitutes the world of relations which we inhabit. And so to inhabit a world where of a magical or by a magical state or from within a magical state, you're not attuning to the distinctions of things. You're sort of just going with what they are and sort of maybe trying to work on them and have them work on you, but that semiotic distinction isn't present to your mind, and so you don't really understand the intelligibility of the world that you're inhabiting when you're in such a state.
I think that's really interesting stuff actually to connect all this. Because in my mind, I'm just thinking of his later existential epistemology stuff for obvious reasons of my review of this for some teaching I'm doing. But I think that's actually a really interesting set of thoughts. I'm just going to leave it sit there. So in the interest of trying to keep us to an hour, I'm going to just say, is there anything you want to close with? Um, so, and that can be the enduring significance of this, or just anything else too. Um,
Yeah, I think not to be all doom and gloom, but again to sort of revisit this point, which we've touched on throughout the discussion. I think it can be very easy, again, sort of in the academic life, in the intellectual life, to view the whole world and to try and view other people strictly through the lenses that we wear most frequently ourselves. But I do think that the sad reality is, well, we haven't regressed to anything primitive. We do live in a world which is very much more nocturnal than perhaps it was when Maritain wrote this essay. Odd as that is to say, right? He's writing this in the late 1930s, and obviously
yeah.
a world which is quite darkened by totalitarianism and war and great atrocities, which weren't even fully at all known to most of the world at the time. But I think there's a different kind of darkness under which we operate today, which isn't to say that there aren't still problems of totalitarianism and war, quite obviously, but this darkness of how a lot of people live. And it's not coincidental that there is in recent years a real resurgence of interest in things like astrology and in magic of some kind, witchcraft. We can sort of pawn it off as saying, okay, well, these people are just sort of, searching for some sort of identity in a social group or something like that. And I'm sure a lot of them are, but I'm sure it also leads to an awful lot of practice of occult things and real belief in, magic and efforts to practice it. So to turn this from sort of the doom and gloom side of things, the sort of recognizing the nocturnality that dominates the world in which we actually live today, and is increasing, sad to say. I also think that, we can, posterity will look back at the 20th century as really one of the darkest in human existence, not just because of the wars and the totalitarianism, but also I think because of the way in which education was perverted, and learning and understanding of what it is to be human was perverted and sort of fell under, the spells of an apparently scientific but actually quite brutal psychology. So again, I'm turning away from the darkness here. Maritain is the turn away from the darkness, I think. We'll look back at this horrible dark century of the 20th, and we'll see Maritain there as this sort of bright light. And this essay is one of those points from which his intellectual brilliance shines forth and can actually help us now in the 21st century to try and recover a better understanding and move forward in a way, in that sense of a living Thomism, for which Maritain was such a great advocate. So those are my closing
Great.
thoughts.
No, great thoughts. So I won't put snow on the bell to stop its ringing. I'll just instead thank you again, Dr. Brian Kemple from the Lyceum Institute, for coming here today. I've been Matthew Minard here with Maritain Musings, and also would like to thank Mr. Michael Hall for his post-production work on this episode. So please be sure to visit us at American Maritain Association. That's AmericanMaritainAssociation.com. And we look forward to future conversations here on Maritain Musings.